Hello, everyone. I am excited today to interview one of my dear friends about space, E2MC Capital, and talk about what the future of investing in space companies might look like. Do you want to quickly introduce the fund and what does E2MC stand for?
There, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me. I'm glad you asked about E2MC. So E2MC, it actually stands for Earth to Mars Capital, and it already tells you a little bit about what we're trying to do here. We're trying to really, help humanity in its way to the planets and the stars, and to finance worthwhile ventures that help us do that along the way. It's of course alternatively also a play on the Einstein formula in the wrong way around before somebody points that out.
So, Raphael, what got you interested in venture capital? When did you realize you wanted to start a venture capital fund? And even more, why space?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my background is actually in financial markets. I started a long time ago in mergers and acquisitions on Wall Street, but then I very quickly moved over to what we call the buy side, so where you invest. And I was investing mostly in public markets, so very mature, multi-billion-dollar companies. And even then, I already thought, well, it would be so cool, if I could do the same thing, but at an earlier stage when these companies get created, when they're starting to create value, when they're like, hiring the first people, when it's what I consider the really exciting phase. A little bit later on, I actually was an entrepreneur myself. I set up a fintech company, one of the first mortgage brokers in Brazil, before fintech was cool in Brazil. And again, of course, because I was fundraising, so I was on the other side of the table, I was interacting with a lot of venture capitalists. And, while I was convinced of what I was doing at the time, I sort of very often envied their position at the side of the table. Like, well, what I'm doing is cool, but there's so many of my entrepreneur colleagues who are also doing very cool new businesses. And what a great life as a venture capitalist, because you have you're not just seeing one thing, but you can actually your daily job is seeing a variety of these things.
That's amazing. Working both as an entrepreneur, a finance person, and now as a venture capitalist, you've seen the whole spectrum of different ways that companies get built and funded from beginning to way later. What are some of the things that surprise you, Raphael, about the venture capital industry? They could be positive things or negative things or just things you never saw coming.
Yeah, interesting. So I think if we start with let's start with the negative. So it's nicer to then end up on the positive. So I think that there is still, and that might be a financing in general, there could be more diversity, certain minority groups, even female venture capitalists. I think there should be much more. And maybe that's even exacerbated in the sector I'm in, right? Because so I'm in venture capital and intersecting with the aerospace industry. You can imagine that is sort of its own old boys club. But so I think that's something we can improve on. And, obviously VC Lab and its cohorts, if you look at them, you guys are doing a very good job trying to help on that. And that's very positive. On the positive side, I think it's, again, considering I was coming from finance, which can be sort of stereotypically cutthroat. I'm not saying it's all like the Wall Street movies from people who are, not from finance, but sometimes it feels a little bit like that. It can be very cutthroat. It can be very competitive. Venture capital, for me, for now, it has been extremely collegiate in terms of people helping each other out, sharing deal flow, sharing due diligence, making intros. It's been really a very positive experience. Of course, there are exceptions. I guess there always are. But by and large, it's been a very nice experience. And I really cherish the community.
Well, as you brought up, you're working at the intersection between space and venture capital. And those two industries, have a lot of stereotypical thing. They tend to be very male dominated. They tend to be pretty geeky, very nerdy. What are some insights or things that you've learned about investing in space that might be interesting to share? Are there a lot of investors out there? Are you oftentimes the only investor? Tell us about the world of space investing these days.
Well, there's more and more investors, but I think we need many more. So obviously, by definition, I'm talking in my book, I'm really excited about the space sector. I think it could be one of the really big new exciting things for the next few decades to come. In terms of like, of course, in terms of size and how big the sector could be, but just also in terms of its importance for humanity, right? And there's so much positive impact you can create with space, whether it's satellite communications to provide education to unconnected kids or monitoring climates. I could just go on an hour giving you examples of positive impact, but you get the point. So, but because of all of that, I really think we need still many more investors who invest in space. So I actually welcome a new space-focused venture funds, and I welcome every generalist fund, whether it's a VC fund or family office that invests in space, and I will do my part to help educate them, by the way. And we also still need more entrepreneurs. I very often, and maybe it's a cliche, but I compare where the space sector is right now to where the internet was sometime in the mid-1990s, where the big technological trends are starting to emerge. And it's mostly about the cost decreases in launch costs, but not only launch costs, but like everything. Like a satellite is much cheaper, like a satellite component, like sensors, like communications equipment, everything is getting much, much, much cheaper. And all of this enables us to do many more things economically in space. But so these big trends are there, similar to how the big trends of the internet, e-commerce instead of bricks and mortar and all of that was there in the internet in the mid-90s. But then it took a few years for that message to spread and investors to get interested and entrepreneurs to come in. And so that's something where we still need to do work in the space sector to bring in more people, whether they're entrepreneurs, investors, employees, just politicians to convince them that space is important, general citizens to convince them that space is important. So that's a very big thing. I'm trying to do my part. And that Adeo, that I do quite a bit of outreach work, the podcast, the book, I teach at a few universities. So that part is very important. And then sort of related to that, because these developments I mentioned are relatively recent, there is just some persistent stereotypes about space, which hark back to the, how space used to be. And so I'll give you a very simple example. One stereotype is like, well, space is like really, really, really expensive, and really only a few governments should, probably like the biggest countries in the world should even touch that and think about that, right? This is what we had. It was like, the former Soviet Union, and then Russia, and then the US, and then a few other countries, now China, of course. But the point being, like, now you can do space privately and you can do it very cheaply. And not everything you do in space has to be very expensive, and not everything you do in space has to be very capital intensive. That's also something we fight against, not fight against, we don't fight with anybody, but we argue, let's say, with potential LPs, because they have this concern, like, isn't that everything is very capital intensive? And my God, you do a seed investment, but then you will need hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars. We're going to get diluted to shreds. It was like, well, it doesn't have, well, it can be advantageous to go to something capital intensive and you build a defensible position. And B, there is actually quite a few business models in space which are not capital intensive. There's all of these guys, for example, explosion of companies now, which analyze satellite data. So they don't do anything themselves in space. They just buy, or sometimes even get for free, the data from other people and analyze that in a value-added way from some industry, whether that's agriculture or insurance companies or mining or oil and gas, you name it. So it's almost like a subscription software as a service business. So there's no capital intensity. So, but all of these things, we still have to the general theme is just have to educate people a lot to make this all happen. And I'm trying to do my part. We are trying to do our part.
Amazing. I agree that there is a tipping point right now that's happening in the space community. We had the first private citizens fly to space on a tourist company, including the owner, Richard Branson, followed by the second within a week. So obviously that's a massive tipping point in and of itself. The other things you brought up about costs and new players entering the market, et cetera, all happening, the lowering costs of things. So staying on the space industry for 1 second, what do you see as some of the big short-term and big medium-term opportunities that get you excited about space right now, and that you can maybe help some others get excited about space the way you feel?
Yeah, and I assume you're talking about sort of investment themes, investment opportunities. So in the short term, I'm just going to pick up with something you mentioned, and most people will have seen it, which is the space tourism part, right? The space tourism flights. I mean, yes, Branson flew. and then Bezos flew, and then actually a lot of people were asking, well, why is Elon not flying? And then I'm also invested in SpaceX, and it was like, I don't want Elon to fly. He's too important. But anyway, that's a side, like that's a side point. But space tourism, we're very excited about. Actually, our first, well, not our first space investment ever, because we made private angel investment, but our first ever investment out of our first fund was a space tourism company called the Space Perspective, which is going to the edge of space, so not technically to space, with stratospheric balloons. A very exciting company, and a lot of people who will look at Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin will also look at Should I Fly on Space Perspective? It's a very different experience. It's, instead of a few minutes, it's a 5-hour ride. You have a spacious capsule. The capsule has a bathroom, but it also has a bar. You can have a drink up there and stand by the window and, meditate if you want, or you can rent the entire capsule and have an event. It's a very, very interesting platform. Between us, it's already a success story. They're now on a follow-on financing. And I shouldn't give any details because it's not out yet, but I think this is going to be a very successful and very interesting company. And generally, we're excited about space tourism because we see a very big supply-demand misbalance. So there's very few ways to actually get near space or to space. There's very few vehicles, right? If you want to go orbital, it's basically the Crew Dragon and Soyuz for the moment. If you're going to go suborbital, it is Virgin Galactic and New Shepard, Blue Origin's vehicle. And then you have the balloon as like another option. But it's very few, very, very few options, very limited seats, so to say. But there's quite a few rich people in the world, even at the prices, and the prices may seem crazy to many people, right? Virgin Galactic just increased the price from $250,000 to $450,000. It didn't surprise me because, again, we see the supply-demand dynamic allows that to happen, and probably this will continue for quite a few years. So very excited in the short term about space tourism and excited about our Space Perspective investment. Another theme where we have an investment which we're very excited about is in-space manufacturing. And I really, very often mention that as a prime example of something that just historically, in the way we used to do space, the expensive way, it just made no economic sense whatsoever. I was like, why would you ever produce anything in space? It's just crazy expensive, right? Now it's all changing. It's really a prime example that because the cost of up mass going to space, but also down mass bringing something back is falling so much, has fallen a lot already, right? And this is before we talk about Starship, SpaceX Starship, which could bring this down 1 or 2 magnitudes, and you could talk hours about this and get me very excited. But even before that, in-space manufacturing suddenly increasingly starts making sense. It depends a little bit on the products, right? We basically have to look at what is the price of the product you produce that you can achieve if you bring it back to Earth, and compare it to the all-in cost, right, of getting the raw materials up there, like the manufacturing, like the little factory, and then bring it back down. But sort of intuitively, of course, the lower the cost drops of doing that, the more materials make sense to produce in space. Now, without starting a very opening Pandora's box, people might now ask, okay, what do we produce in space and why? It's basically got to do with special conditions we only find in space. The most important of them, the lack of gravity. Which then means you can do certain things which you can't do on Earth, like grow very nice crystals in 3 dimensions, or you can bind certain materials which wouldn't easily bind on Earth, or mix them, so-called emulsions. And I mean, we could talk about hours for that too. But so in-space manufacturing is an example of something we're very excited, honestly, probably for the next 1 or 2 decades at least.
Amazing. I am also excited about the short, medium, and even long-term prospects of space, because once the colonization, inhabitation, whatever term you prefer to use, of another planet happens, everything will go truly bonkers in terms of how often people go, how frequently things need to be sent up, back, etc. So switching back to venture capital as an industry and turning off from space as an industry, and I am a fan of space personally, so we can talk about space all day, but we are here also to talk about venture capital. So what do you think new managers should consider when launching a new fund, and maybe a lesson that you learned the hard way that you can share to make their journey easier?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a lesson I learned only with venture capital, because I was doing different financial products, a different type of fund management before. But there is, let me phrase it this way, there's the whole sort of like, in the hedge fund world where I used to be, we always talk about, another part, like the front office where you do the actual investing work, right? And then there's also like the so-called middle and back office, which is all of the, let's call it the piping and the stuff that needs to happen for you to actually invest. And that's basically includes all of the legal and tax and structuring and so forth work, right? And clearly, as you can imagine, if you're excited about most people who are excited about the investing are not very excited about that part of the work, sort of like trying to learn about many different jurisdictions in the world where you could set up your fund and how the setup there works, what the tax consequences are for LPs for different regions. But that stuff is really important. And if you don't realize it's important, your potential LPs will at some point in time point out that it's important, that you want to understand the tax consequences, or that, oh, you set up your fund in this jurisdiction, and I'm sorry, I think what you're doing is really cool, but I cannot invest in you because I cannot invest in this jurisdiction. So all of that is important, and you need to have good advisors on board, legal advisors and tax advisors, and it's just it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. And it's another thing I could say, it's a necessary evil. Well, I shouldn't call these people evil. I mean, honestly, my wife is a COO and is doing that kind of stuff as a job, and she's certainly not evil. But you're saying it's like a lot of people who are excited, who get very excited about venture capital because they want to do the investments, sort of forget that it's this whole part, and you need to kind of take care of that. And certainly, if you're an emerging manager, as most of us are, and certainly in VC lab, you probably don't have the luxury that you're starting with like a fully staffed, back office and have like blue chip advisors that kind of help you from day one. You will spend time on this, and it's just something you have to go through.
Thank you. No, it's great advice as well. And before, you mentioned a couple portfolio companies that you've already invested in. They sound very exciting. What are some of and you're focused on a niche industry, compared to, let's say, SaaS or something like that in the space field. What are some of the techniques that you're using to find great deals? And then how are you qualifying them for investment? Any sort of insights on that would be lovely, Raphael.
Yeah, so we're kind of basically going about it. Again, this may sound cliche, but in two big ways. One is sort of bottom up, the other one is top down. So I'll start with, let's say, the bottom up. The bottom up is basically where, companies, individual opportunities come to us through various sources. And, increasingly, as our name is out there, and this will be a similar experience for other people, there's inbound flow, just people send you business plans, and that's fine, obviously. But then you also have to do some work. So we try to, we just try to stay very deep in the community. I mean, the advantage we still have is that the space community is, for now, and I believe it's going to continue to be, is a relatively close community. So I always joke that, it's like when you go to space conferences, really big space conferences like Space Symposium, which is happening right now in Colorado, you always meet the same 2,000 people, and I love them all. But and this is good and bad. As I say, it kind of supports my argument that we really need to bring more people to the space industry. But on the other hand, once you're inside, you behave as a good citizen. That part I think is very important, right? I mean, I think the space community, and Adeo, you are a part of it, so you know this. The vast majority are idealists, right? And they can sniff out an opportunist or a materialist or somebody who's just in it for advantage without giving back. They can sniff that out in a second, and they don't like that a lot. But so I think if you behave as a good citizen, which we hopefully do, and again, I try to do a lot of outreach and teaching and mentoring and, unpaid mentoring, right? And all of this, then I think you get a lot back, and people refer you a lot. That network brings a lot, right? That bigger network. Then of course, there's also more specific networks. So there's for example, there's a few incubators and accelerators which specialize in space, aerospace. And I personally am, again, an unpaid mentor at quite a few of them, like, for example, a Creative Destruction Lab out of Canada, which some people may know, Seraphim, which actually is another space fund, just later stage, but they have a seed stage incubator, where I mentor. The International Space University has a program where I also mentor. So I do a few of those things. Then, of course, our network, our portfolio companies, right? My partners' networks. So there's quite a few of different ways where the bottom-up stuff comes in. The top-down stuff is different. The top-down stuff is basically where we get together periodically as a team and just brainstorm, including advisors, and just brainstorm. It was like, okay, given our knowledge of the sector, and hopefully we have some sort of smart knowledge, what do we think? Where is this going? What could be the next few trends, right? Okay, so now we believe space manufacturing is something big, but what could be something else? And you really try to kind of go through this intellectual exercise.
Awesome. And then I presume you source deals based on, some of those theories. And when you source a deal or identify a deal that you're interested in, either from the bottom up or top down, what are some of the mechanisms for diligence and decision making that you use to finally invest in them?
That's obviously really important. And so I'm not going to bore you with let's quote unquote the typical diligence. I mean, obviously a team is really important, and getting references on the team and seeing what they have done before, understanding we're talking seed stage, right? So people are still committing 5-10 years of their lives to this, understanding, okay, do you know what you're doing here? You're committing a substantial part of your life. Why are you doing this? Have you not heard Elon saying that entrepreneurship is like eating glass? He's right. I've been an entrepreneur, right? So we do all of that stuff, right? Checking the team and, checking like IP, some other legal stuff. But let's talk, I guess, specifically about space, because it's a deep tech industry, right? And I really want people to respect that, right? And that's also why I think we have, I mean, again, I'm talking my book, but I think, we have a reason to exist as specialized space fund. I don't think that generalist funds should necessarily do space deals. I think they can co-invest with people like us. That's totally fine. And I want them to, right? But I do think there's a reason for space specialized funds to exist. Part of it is what we just talked about, the deal sourcing, that it is specialized networks and that do indoor specialized networks, which are not necessarily easy to get into and stay into. But another reason is the diligence, really understanding what's going on and having access to experts who can help you on stuff like the technical due diligence as well, right? One very important point here on space that some people may not realize, but it's probably intuitive once you start thinking about it, is there is generally no such thing as a general space expert. Like the person you need to talk to doing diligence on a rocket engine is going to be a completely different person than the person you have to speak to do diligence on a satellite communications antenna, right? I mean, there are some crazy, weird, wonderful people in the world who actually know a little bit about everything, but a very, very, very few. I mean, probably Elon is one of them. I don't know, but there are very, very few. And Elon, unfortunately, is not on our technical advisory board. But in any event, so what we try to do is we realize we're covering all of these areas in space, whether it's again rocket engines, what we call Earth observation or remote sensing, right? So you have to understand the sensors and some other things, satellite communications, space tourism, and then even like some more esoteric stuff. But we realize we need to have at least one expert in each of these subfields. And that's what we're doing. We have at least one expert in each of these subfields that we can go to if an interesting company comes up that we need to do technical due diligence on. And sometimes, if we don't have, if you want more than one, we'll find additional people, and it has been working very well. And again, we use this network we have access to. I give you another really interesting point, something that I didn't think about at the very beginning, but it's increasingly clear to me now. We now sometimes divide the world of space investing into two parts. And one part is actually the part of people who are actually, let's call it, space companies who actually enable going to space or operating in space. So people like rocket companies, people who build satellites, people like that, right? And then you need a certain type of expert. But then there's a whole different class of companies we can invest in, which are not traditional space companies in that sense, that are building rockets or satellites, but they're basically using space to do something else interesting on Earth, right? So again, they might be companies who use satellites to generate really interesting data for, let's say, agriculture or something like that, right? So now you realize if you really want to understand and do diligence on that business, you should have the space expert, right? Because the space expert will tell you like, okay, can that satellite actually produce that data? Is that data any good and so forth? But then let's say if I continue with this example of like data for agriculture, you should really talk to a person from agriculture as well, because that's the target market. It's kind of really important. And I think a lot of people are forgetting that. And frankly, actually, a lot of entrepreneurs are forgetting that. It's one problem we have at the moment in the space sector is that 95% of entrepreneurs are basically from the space sector, even if they want to do something for agriculture or insurance or some other target sector. And they're like, well, you really need somebody on the team who understands the target sector. That's really important. And so in terms of our due diligence process, what we're now increasingly developing is a capability for the key target sectors we see, for example, like agriculture or insurance, to do things like have specialists we can access. And also what we're increasingly doing is building relationships with VCs that specialize in those sectors. So if, for example, you have a situation where we invest in a company that's doing Earth observation for agriculture, I'll talk to my friends at the agriculture VC. I was like, I said, well, is that data actually useful for like, because they know much better than me.
Amazing. So I want to talk a little bit about how we met through the VC Lab program. You learned of VC Lab, you got interested somehow and decided to enroll. What was your process there to discover and decide to enroll in VC Lab?
Well, I mean, I should take a step back here for fun and say, when we probably didn't meet at VC Lab, we almost certainly met when I was a freshman, you were a senior at Penn, and I was going to Oracle parties because I thought those were the best parties on campus. The problem is none of us two remember that. But in any event, because the parties were so good. VC Lab was brought by one of our members at E2MC, who's sort of an entrepreneur / executive in residence, Guillermo Sohnlein, who has been involved in the space sector for 15 plus years. He's the original founder of something called Space Angels, which still exists and it's the largest angel group in the space sector. And he forwarded to me this email from when VC Lab was being announced. I was like, well, this sounds really interesting. And, yes, I've been in the financial markets, but I actually have not done VC before. And this sounds like a really nice structured program. So that's, I think, the one part. And then the other part, which I think retrospectively I really cherish a lot, is just the community. It's the cohort, right? You meet all of these other people in the same, even if they have a completely different investment thesis, focusing on a different sector or like are located in a different country or something. It's just the community is such a rich source of, exchanging experiences, just being able to ask questions, just like, the hive mind, right?
Yeah, it's been amazing. And I didn't know that about Penn, and hopefully the network will pay dividends in more ways than just friendship and camaraderie. As I said, there may even be a limited partner interested. Will be amazing. All right, final question for you. This has been amazing. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So for all the new managers out there today, if you were to give a parting piece of advice, what would that be? And maybe in space, out of space, any new manager, what would be a parting piece of advice?
Oh God, there would be so many things, right? I mean, so without talking our book here, I think if they're not in VC Lab, they should consider applying to VC Lab, and I truly mean that. I truly think it's value add for those two reasons I mentioned: the structured program where you may learn some things you haven't thought about in a structured way before, and then the community. So I think that's really important. Taking that community point, I think it's just really important to just network a lot, right? And again, so I'm going to talk about LPs in a second, but that's obviously one part of networking. But sometimes you can get LPs from some network where you wouldn't have expected to get LPs. So it's important. But I mean, networking just with everybody. Again, just other VCs as well, because they might refer deal flow, they might refer potential LPs, they might refer advisors. I mean, who knows? Just generally smart people in the sector you operate in the country where you are. I think the networking part is really, really important. On the LP part, unless you're somehow blessed with, I don't know, some captive money or some family that already knows you or some anchor you already have, I mean, you just have to be psychologically prepared that it's going to be a slog. Especially for emerging managers and especially sort of the sizes of emerging managers. I mean, we currently have a situation in the financial markets where, for a variety of reasons, I always joke, like our fund right now, we're raising $30 million. And I always joke around that, raising $300 million is actually much easier than raising $30 million right now. But anyways, you raise $30 million, like you're probably going to have hundreds of meetings, and you just have to be psychologically, and most of them will be no's, but you have to be psychologically prepared. But if you put in the work, then hopefully it'll pay off.
That's a beautiful, it was funny. I interviewed another alumni fund, and we were talking about this very thing and very similar advice. And one of the things he said is he started to really enjoy it because he's turned it into a game. And like every no is an opportunity to reflect on how to get a yes the next time. And he's like, yeah, I don't mind no's because they give me feedback. And sometimes it's a real no, and sometimes it's a no because they woke up on the wrong side of the bed. And I get to learn which type of no it is and like get better. So he's actually come to love fundraising. I think sadly that's going to happen if you want to raise a fund, learn to love fundraising.
Yeah, I'll give you another sort of like a funny ending anecdote on that. So in the space sector, we have a whole additional problem that other sectors may not have, and that is that with the LP meetings and sort of getting those, that space, I guess, for most people, it's hard to find people who don't find space exciting. I mean, you almost have to be a freak, right? It's like saying you don't like kittens or something. And so it's really hard for us to when we get like an intro to some family office or something, for the family office not to take the meeting. Even if retrospectively we find out that actually they cannot allocate because, for whatever reason, they just want to sit down for an hour and like hear about space, which just really happens. Now, to end this on a positive note, it now has happened at least a couple of times where actually the end of the meeting was like this, like the family office then said look, actually, sorry, we can't allocate because like this is just off the risk spectrum for the family office or, whatever reason. But a couple of times it's happened that then the principal, right, so like the CIO, right, who themselves by virtue of managing a family office are wealthy people, said, I'm just going to do this personally outside of the family office.
That is amazing, Raphael. Thank you so much for the feedback. This has been one of my favorite interviews for two reasons. Like the family offices, I got to talk about space for a half an hour. And second, it's always great to hear how successful everything's been going for you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adair.